ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Dinozor Gaming, where we learn to be a better player. Today, we're doing a deck tech on Kit Fisto, and more specifically, Kit Fisto Command. So we're going to be looking at what Kit Fisto does, especially in these colors. Of course, Kit Fisto is fairly flexible enough to be able to be used with yellow or blue as well. But I've had the best success with this color. So let's go ahead and quickly check out what Kit Fisto does. He says, action, pay 1. If you attack with a Jedi this phase, deal 2 damage to a unit. That is a very strong leader ability. Dealing 2 damage to a unit for the cost of 1 is basically Daring Raid. It can't hit bases, of course, that is a downside, but being able to dish out 2 damage, ideally every single turn, is very powerful. It's having an extra card in your hand that your opponent doesn't have access to. Of course, the drawback is that you need to be attacking with a Jedi unit, but considering the sheer amount of those units available to us, especially in this set, I don't think that's much of a downside. Now, of course, Kit Fisto flips on 5 as a 1/6 Saboteur. That is not an ideal stat line. It's not what you want to be seeing, especially in your leader. However, he does get an extra +1 attack for each other friendly Jedi unit. Now, of course, we have the option here to be playing a Force base, which is what we are doing. But Kit Fisto as a leader does not need the Force. So you do have the option to play other bases. If you want, you could play this in an energy conversion lab list if you want to be playing some of those like more aggressive ambush late game stuff like Wrecker or Poe. You could be playing this in a basic 30 health base or even a data vault if you just want more cards. You do have that option, but with my testing I found that this is the best way to build Kit Fisto. With the amount of Jedis that you're going to be putting in your deck anyways, you might as well be generating the Force. So let's take a look at some of the deck lists here. I'm going to show them right off the bat. I will have the links below in the description, so don't worry about that. I know a lot of people just want to see these, but we're also going to be talking about each card that is in here and what their purposes are, why they're there, what are the best strategies, what are tech options for you. And this is the list that I've had the most success with. It's a bit faster, more aggressive. It plays a bit like a slower aggro deck. You do have that option with that leader ability to slowly control the game in the beginning. The first 2 to 3 turns you want to play for the board until you're wide enough where you just say, okay, I'm gonna hit the base, and at that point you become the raw aggro deck. And of course, if you want, there is a slightly slower version that you could be playing here. I tested with this quite a bit as well. It does have a much better matchup into other aggressive decks, if that's what you're seeing in your local meta, but it does fall short versus those slower control decks, as in these color pairings you normally don't have enough power to outlast those decks. So all that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the deck's core and what are the cards that make it interesting. So of course we have the low cost Jedis like Gungi, Obi-Wan, Adigalia. What makes these cards so great, not only is their stat line fantastic, but they are also Force, so they'll generate the token for you. They are also Jedis, which will buff up Ki-Adi-Mundi. These are cards that you'll be playing no matter what in a Kit Fisto deck. We have Ki-Adi-Mundi here, which is, once again, same tags, which is what you want to be seeing. 4 cost 4/4 is not ideal stat line, but you may use the Force to draw 2 cards. If you are being the aggressor in a deck, if you are playing a lot of low cost cards, emptying out your hand, you need draw power, and Ki-Adi-Mundi gives you exactly that. And being able to refill your hand and just play more cards than your opponent makes it so it's okay if you're trading 2 for 1 or 1 for 2 in this case, because you'll just overwhelm your opponent with so much stuff. We have Maz Kanata. It works a bit like a Fleet Lieutenant, but for Force, and considering a vast majority of the deck, I think almost all of the deck is Force, I think this is an auto-include, a fantastic card. And something worth mentioning for Maz Kanata is that if you are playing any sort of Force mirror match, as in any other deck that needs the Force, Maz can single-handedly win you the game, or at least win you the ground arena by turn 2. And what I mean by that is, in this set, initiative is extremely important. It has always been important, but starting the game, especially for game 1, can sometimes just completely deny your opponent any opportunities from getting the Force token. Let's go with a very short example here. Let's say you started off turn 1 with a Gungi, and your opponent plays a 2/4. They could be playing Adigalia, they could be playing the new Karis that Mother Talzin is playing, for example, and you claim the initiative, you play Maz Kanata, your Gungi attacks for 4, gets rid of their guy, you generate the force, they no longer have a unit, now you have a 2-3 or a 2-2 in play, as well as a 3-4, and even if they play something now, next turn you have the initiative again, and you get to kill whatever they just played, and you just deny them the force over and over and over. I think just that alone is a huge advantage of this deck. Of course, we have General's Blade, one of the cards that has been talked about a lot. This is another card that can single-handedly win you the game. Once again, on turn 2 potentially, versus some colors who have less access to upgrade removal or just easy kill spells. So you don't want to be using this versus a blue villainy, for example. They're going to have Power of the Dark Side, but versus another red-green deck, like a Sabine, for example, if you put a General's Blade on turn 2, the odds of them having a removal for it are very slim, and if they don't remove it right away, you'll just steal the game. You get to attack with something that's huge. If you have another 2-drop in your hand, you get to drop it, and if you don't, next turn you'll attack with it, and you're playing something 2 turns ahead of time. It's devastating. This is one of those cards that this set a lot of people are worried about, and having access to it needs to be attached to a Jedi, ideally, right? And well, most of our deck is Jedi. Then otherwise, in the later aspect, we have Kelleran Beck and Mace Windu, both phenomenal cards on the top end. Mace Windu is very similar to Wrecker. It has a bit different stat lines. Instead of being a 7/6, it's a 6/6. It still has the Overwhelm. It can use the Force to deal 4 damage instead of losing a resource. Honestly, it's so similar to the card. Fantastic card. Being able to use the Force to deal 4 damage is very good, and it's not only to a ground unit. This could be used versus space units as well, and just overall a fantastic card to round it out. Again, Force Jedi, that's what we want to be seeing. Now, Kelleran Beck is one of those cards that is just outright good. Even if he was not a Force Jedi, you would probably be playing this card. 7 cost, 7/7 is very decent in stat lines, and his when played effect is very similar to Vader, of course, searching the top 7 cards of your deck for a unit. Reveal it and play it, it costs 3 less. Now, the main difference between this card and other cards that we've seen that work very similarly is that you don't actually need to be playing something that costs 3 or less. Whatever you play just costs 3 less. So if you actually make it to a much later aspect of the game, if you're at 10 resources and you play this, you can pull something that costs 5, even 6 from your deck and play it. That is an insane amount of action compacting that can just outright dominate the board in a position where your opponent thinks that they have control of it. If you just top deck this on 10 resources, play a 7 cost, play a 6 cost, and at that point they need to play something, they need to answer it, and since you've already spent all of your resources, you'll just claim the initiative, you'll have it. It's a fantastic answer to things like Super Laser Blast, for example, or if your opponent just finally traded all of their units, they think they just cleared the board, well, here you go, you can just put a bunch of other stuff into play. Now, we're also going to be talking about Syndrelig. This is one of the legendaries from the set that has been very quickly disregarded. So one of the issues with a deck like this is that there isn't too much options for reach in these colors if you're not playing your typical energy conversion lab. Normally a Sabine deck will get you down fairly weak and then use that ambush unit with a Wrecker, for example, to dish out a bunch of damage from hand. Alternatively, they do use For a Cause I Believe In, which is a card that I do think you have the option to be playing in this deck. You don't have a lot of non-heroic cards. I think the main 2 non-heroic cards that you'll be playing are seen here on the screen in Maz Kanata and General's Blade, but otherwise that is an option. Now, Syndrelig serves a very similar purpose. However, he does cost more. 8 is pretty heavy, which is why this deck isn't exactly as fast as Sabine or other aggro decks like Kylo Ren, for example, but it is just a slightly slower one, and having access to this card makes it so you can just deal a massive amount of damage when your opponent doesn't expect it. Now, you're going to be playing lightsabers anyways, because, for example, General's Blade, why would you not be playing this? And we'll be talking about another lightsaber, for example, we'll be talking about another lightsaber soon that is perfect for this deck in particular, but in general, being able to drop this on turn 7 when you have 8 resources, putting a lightsaber on it for free, you get to ready him. So when you come in you pay 8 resources, you come in with 8 attack, and you are ready. Which means that if your opponent does once again use up all of their resources to deal with your board, let's say they did a super laser blast, or let's say they just played an Avenger, well, you can drop this and deal 8 damage to their base. And if you are playing this aggressive deck well enough, 8 damage to the base on turn 7 should ideally end the game. So this is a straight up finisher. This is not a card that you'll just be playing to control the board or anything. You just want to use this to end it. And of course, we would be remiss to not talk about Force Throw, another one of the cards that is very, very talked about this set. Force Throw, choose a player. That player discards a card from their hand. If you control a force unit, deal damage to a unit equal to the cost of the discarded card. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what makes Force Throw so great, but being able to use it so easily when 90% of your deck is a force cards, this is an auto include, and sometimes this card will just win you the game out of sheer value. Either you're making your opponent discard all of their cards so they can't play anything, or they only have high cost left in their hand, or your opponent just flipped over their leader and you Force Throw, you target yourself, you throw away a Kelleran back, and you just killed their leader for 1. That's insane value, that's insane tempo, and that's what you want in this deck. Now let's talk a bit about the strengths and weaknesses of this deck and what makes it different or unique. So, of course, it is an extremely fast deck, and by that I mean that it's pretty low to the ground. You have a lot of low-cost units, but that doesn't mean you don't have any late game. As we saw, there are some high-cost cards that work very well with the strategy. You have one of the absolute best leader abilities. Honestly, an extra 2 damage every single turn. I don't think there's many leaders that can compete with that in terms of raw power. But, of course, on the flip side, you do have lower stat line. It is pretty easy to trigger your leader. All you need to do is land an attack with a Jedi, and considering most of your deck is Jedi, as long as you got to attack with anything, you can trigger it. You can save the force for units. This is an interesting one because a lot of the new leaders that are good this set, if they are using a force deck, usually your leader has the monopoly on the force. And that is... what makes this so interesting is that you get to save that force and use it for units like Mace Windu or like Yoda that want the force, or like Kiarimundi, and you don't need to worry about wasting it because your leader doesn't need it. Variety in deck builds. There are a lot of Jedis, a ton of Jedis, so you're not locked into a single type of build. So if you look at a lot of other decks that are coming up, this for example, if you look at a Mother Talzin deck, it's a pretty compact list. You already kind of know what the vast majority of deck is going to be. You're going to be running those cards no matter what. Whereas in this, there are so many options for Jedis. You can be playing the typical path of just ground units, or you could once again play a non-force deck. You could play space Jedis, because of course the Jedi doesn't mean it is a force unit. There are a lot of spaceships that are considered Jedi. You just have so many options, and it's going to make it so your opponent doesn't exactly know what's in your deck. Doesn't need to force synergy. Once again, you don't need to actually play specific cards to force your deck to work together. Just because you're going to be playing these cards anyway. These are just good cards that you're playing. You're not going out of the way and picking up the random stuff that you're not playing an Imperial deck that absolutely needs to run those Imperial cards. All of the cards that are in your deck are cards that you would be playing anyways. They just happen to have the Jedi tag, and it works very well with Kit Fisto. And of course, able to steal games fast with General's Blade, and I should have written with Force Throw as well. Those are the 2 cards that are spoken about this set. It was even mentioned by FFG that these are cards that they're keeping an eye on. Everyone is considering them to be borderline broken this set, so having a deck that can play both of those makes it a huge strength. Now, as for weaknesses, of course, very weak stats for a deployed leader. I think this is one of the key aspects of why everyone is disregarding Kit Fisto. Of course, a 1/6 leader is not strong. But if you are playing this deck the right way, if you are going fairly wide, dropping a lot of low-cost units, and even if your opponent is able to deal with a few of them, in a perfect world, and in average world actually, you'll end up having at least 2 other units on the turn that your leader comes out, and that way your leader will be a 3/6. And that is on an average world. If you're playing it very well and your opponent hasn't been able to deal with your stuff, let's say you have 1 unit left over on the flip turn, or you can play 2 more from your hand, flip your leader. Now you're a 4/6. And not only do they have to deal with the rest of your board, they now have to also deal with a 4/6 leader that can ignore sentinels, that can kill shielded units. Pretty good. That said, it is still a lot of work just to get some stats on your leader, so it is quite the weakness for Kit Fisto. Requires snowballing early. You are a more aggressive, low to the ground deck, so you do need to take control of the board and dish out enough damage early game so that your reach at the end can close out the game. If your opponent manages to control you early, leave you nothing on the board, it's very hard to come back. And that comes out to the next point, low comeback potential. If you don't get to attack with your units, not only are you not generating the force, but you're also not able to use your leader ability. It becomes very hard to come back from that position. And of course, difficult running staples. Yes, you do have the option to be running stuff like Energy Conversion Lab with Wrecker and Poe. And while those are fantastic cards, fantastic combinations that are usually used in these colors, these guys are not Jedis, they're not force units, so they don't work too well with the deck. They're still usable, they're still playable, they can still sometimes win you the game, of course, but it does make the deck a bit awkward. And of course, no easy reach options. The only one that we really have is Syndrelig and For a Cause I Believe In. Those are pretty decent options, but those are not the best options. Of course, For a Cause I Believe In is pretty good, and I think we've all been on the receiving end of For a Cause I Believe In that's been chained back to back. But this deck usually doesn't have the space or doesn't want to rely on cards like that, so it's just not very convenient to use. Now, what are some important synergies, combos, and notes for this deck? So of course, we're going to be saying you need to save some kind of buff for your leader flip. So luckily for us, yes, that 1/6 sightline is bad for Kit Fisto, but there are a lot of ways to fix that. And what I mean by that is, of course, you have General's Blade, which will buff up your leader. Putting that on your leader will make it a 4/9 if you have no other Jedis. And a 4/9 leader on turn 4 is pretty hard to deal with. Your opponent will need some kind of upgrade hate or direct removal. And most people don't have access to that early. The initiative should determine your mulligan strategy. We did mention quite a bit about the importance of Maz Kanata on turn 2. Same thing for General Blade. You need to know when to mulligan for what. Of course, this is very matchup dependent as well. If you're, for example, versus a Vader aggro space deck, you don't want to be finding your low drop grounds. Like, it doesn't matter if you find your Obi-Wans and your Gungis if your opponent's just going to overwhelm you in space. So you want to find your Jedi ships early on for that. If you're playing versus a Sabine deck, you want a mulligan for a General's Blade and an Obi-Wan Kenobi. You need to understand how important it is for a deck that needs to attack. Your mulligan is key. Use your leader ability as often as possible. What makes Kiarimundi so good is that playing 1 to deal 2 damage. So if you're playing on curve all the time and not using your leader ability, you might as well be playing another leader because your flip is already weaker than a lot of other leaders. So in order to make up for it, you want to be using your leader ability every single turn. Otherwise, you are better off just playing another leader. If you simply like these colors and you want to play the same deck, but you find that you're always playing on curve and not able to trigger your leader ability, well, you can take the exact same list and play something like, for example, the new Obi-Wan Kenobi. But what makes Kit Fisto so good is that you can play slightly below curve, but dish out that 2 damage to clear out your opponent's board, so there's less stuff in the way of your units, so you can just hit that base. You are mostly an aggro deck. Don't stall, and as I just said, hit the base. So you want to win the board in the first 2 to 3 turns, and after that, screw it, just hit the base, get your opponent as low as possible. At that point, they need to trade into your units, and just by doing that, they'll clear their own board, and whatever they don't end up clearing, you'll just finish off with your leader ability. So now, some important notes. We spoke a ton about Maz Kanata and General's Blade. Key cards that you need to play properly. If you just drop a General's Blade on turn 2 and you get Power of the Dark-Sided, you will just lose the game. Also, you ideally don't want to do it when your opponent has a ton of resources open. They could be doing something like a Disabling Fang Fighter, for example. So understanding when to use these, a lot of it will come with practice and experience and knowing your opponent's deck, but you can get the general gist of it. You don't want to play this against blue villainy. You don't want to put it in a way where your unit can just get waylaid. So just understanding what the removal options are for every single color, you have to understand when to play these cards. Next up, we have Mace Windu that can be used with Timely Intervention. This is very similar to Wrecker. As we said, this is another way for you to have some kind of reach. What's interesting is that this deals 4 damage to a unit and then ambushes, unlike Record, which deals 5 damage to a unit. It does seem like a downgrade, but what makes Mace Windu so interesting is that a ton of the new Sentinels this set are actually 3/5s. And when you have Wrecker in play and you use the ability to kill that Sentinel, there's a chance that they have nothing else in play for you to ambush into, or that whatever you are ambushing into is just big, or the overwhelm is not working out. Whereas a lot of those Sentinels, when you deal 4 damage to them and then overwhelm, you're doing 5 damage to their base from hand. And Timely Intervention, being a smuggle, means you're not actually wasting 2 cards for it. So it's a very good combination to keep in mind when you're playing it. If you've fallen behind on base damage, if you need to just outright deal a bunch of damage from hand and your opponent doesn't expect it. And of course, Syndrelig with Knight's Saber, another one of the lightsabers that I think are fantastic this set. Apologies, you can't see the card perfectly here. It's a 2 cost that says give a Jedi unit +3/+2 for 2. A fantastic saber, serves a very similar purpose as General's Blade, but what makes it extra interesting, on top of being able to be used with Syndrelig, is that if you play this on turn 2 on a unit, you're still attacking with an extra 3 attack, but you're leaving 1 resource open for you to use your leader ability, and that's what you want to be doing anyways. So if you have a Gungi and you equip this on turn 2, that Gungi is now hitting for 5, then use your leader ability, deal 2 damage to their unit, and at that point, if that unit is still alive, well, it's probably going to die next turn, but you just following up with the same play. Some key cards as well are Kelleran Beck and Ewing Reinforcement, a fantastic way for you to just get cards from your deck, making draw a bit less important. And these cards help you spam the board, especially Ewing Reinforcement, being able to play up to 3 units. Ewing can even fetch Kelleran Beck letting you play essentially 10 resources worth of cards for 7. You can do Ewing into Kelleran, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting combinations you can do. If you have the initiative, you can play the Jedi Knight to deal 2 damage to something while you're developing the board. Or if you, for example, you have Luke Skywalker, you can, if you sequence it correctly, like if you play a Ewing Reinforcement and you play a Luke Skywalker first, and then the second card you play is unique, like let's say, I don't know, Mos Kanata, that lets you attack with something, well, you can then trigger the Force on play, give Luke Skywalker a shield and experience, and then Mos Kanata will attack with the unit that's already in play, regenerating the Force, allowing you to then immediately use something else to buff Luke, or maybe even use it next turn. And Luke is another way for you to use the Force, and as we mentioned, this deck doesn't have a lot of built-in Force usage, so you'll have a lot of Force lying around to use with this card. Of course, the downside being that Luke himself is not a Jedi, but that's okay. The card is very good by itself anyways. So now let's talk a bit about the matchups in the meta. This is what's very important. We're not going to cover every single deck, but I have a few decks, at least for every archetype, and I think we'll get a general idea of how that works. So of course, number 1 being Mother Talzin. Mother Talzin is one of the new leaders this set, and considered one of the strongest ones this set by a lot of players. And I think this is usually Mother Talzin will be played in either red or green. This is not a great matchup for Kit Fisto. The reason being that you want to be able to keep your board, and Mother Talzin especially early on specializes in dealing with early units. Most of the Mother Talzin decks that we've seen don't play a ton of late game, but they want to win the board early on, and they have extremely powerful effects for that. So it's going to be very hard for you to keep units in play, and that's why I think Mother will be a pretty weak matchup. And on top of that, she flips over on 5 as well as a 3/7 that can also give a -1/-1 to a unit. So the leader is just going to beat your leader anyways. I think this is just a unfortunate situation, an unfortunate matchup for Kit Fisto. It's just another deck that can beat you faster at the board than you can do to them. Next up, we have decks like Yoda and Anakin, usually played in red-blue heroism. This set, this color combination has seen quite the boost, and they're playing a ton of card draw, a ton of restore. This matchup is another one that's not too great for the deck. I know we're not off to a great start, but don't worry, it does get better. I think just due to the fact that they have a lot of sturdy units, they're able to trade up, they're able to draw a bunch of cards, so some of your discard effects are less important. And they can outlast you through their amount of restore. This is just generally not a great matchup for you. Next up, we have Cad Bane or Quinlan Voss, which are the ping leaders, I suppose, usually played with Tarkin Town. This is an interesting one because I think this is a pretty 50-50 matchup for you. This comes down more about your game knowledge than the actual decks, being able to manipulate where the pings are going. Your opponent's going to try and kill off your units as efficiently as possible, but they usually end up having very weak and fragile units themselves, which means your leader ability can knock them off left and right. You can kill those Greedos for essentially free, or you can finish off anything that's lost a shield. I think this is a very skill dependent matchup, and I don't think anyone has a particular advantage. Next up, we have Sabine Wren. It's not just Sabine, but just aggro decks in general. For example, Kylo Ren or anything super fast. I think Kit Fisto has quite the advantage into those decks. So in general, if you are playing something that's just a bit slower than an aggro deck, you'll end up keeping pace with them. You are able to control the board and deal with their units while keeping some of your units alive. Your leader ability helps you finish off units that your sturdy units have hit. And on top of that, they usually don't have easy ways to deal with, for example, General's Blade or Force Throw or anything like that. And you even have access to some good healing options if you want to tech them in versus Sabine. We have the new Yoda's lightsaber, which is pretty good. It uses the Force to heal you. It's another lightsaber for Sindrelig. I think just it's a very good matchup for you to go up against other aggro decks. Next up, we have control decks like Kira and Kylo. These are decks that are much slower, of course, and this set, it seems that they're navigating more towards Energy Conversion Lab like they used to, mainly because of the new Darth Vader Legendary, making it so their base total is actually 25. That makes it a pretty good matchup for you. It's not super easy for these decks to kill every single thing every single turn, so if one or two things survive, especially on your leader flip turn, if you don't get completely devastated by the Kira flip herself, you'll usually have enough damage on their base where your reach can kill them off before they can heal back up. That said, if they are playing the slower versions with Data Vault, it does become a bit more challenging. Having to do that extra 8 damage gives them at least another couple of turns for them to catch up with you, for their healing to start kicking in, and at that point, it becomes very hard to finish them off. So I think this is an interesting take where the matchup could be skewed in your favor or in theirs, depending on what base they are running. Next up, we have Darth Vader, a pretty unique deck in that it is a space aggro deck, usually played with Cunning, spamming a lot of TIE Fighters in play. I think this is a very interesting matchup, and this could be it could be hard to deal with a lot of those space units, but I think that Kit Fisto himself has a lot of tools to deal with it. You have that new Jedi Starfighter that can dish out a damage when attacking. It is a Jedi, so it'll trigger your leader ability. So honestly, between a lot of your small damage abilities and your leader ability, you have a pretty easy time of keeping the space clear. And on top of that, you are playing red, which means you can have in your sideboard bombing runs, which almost nullify the deck. So I think this matchup is heavily in your favor. Next up, we have Han Solo. It's played very similarly to Yoda and Anakin that we spoke about earlier, but it is a bit more aggro, a bit more fast. The deck relies on playing stuff ahead of the curve by dealing 2 damage to them. I think this is actually a bit better of a matchup for Kit Fisto because their units are already damaged. You get to finish them off faster with your leader ability. It is still not a cakewalk of a matchup. I think Han Solo just being able to play those units, those big units really early on, could sometimes set up a wall in front of you that you can't get over. But I think this is a 50-50 matchup. And finally, we have Han Solo, a leader that has been good from set 1. I think it's pretty similar to Han Solo that we spoke about right before, playing some kind of ramp, temporary ramp, of course, but being able to play bigger units ahead of the curve. But once again, their units aren't usually the sturdiest, so your leader ability should be able to help clean that up. The Millennium Falcon is usually quite the annoying card to deal with, but you are able to kill it over 2 turns for just 2 mana. For resources rather. This is a pretty 50-50 matchup, I think. That said, you need to be careful not to overinvest into a single unit because they have a ton of bounce options. So I think this is not a particularly favored matchup on either side. Now let's take a quick look at some tech options that you have in this deck. Well, a lot of these seem to be red. Pillage is a fantastic choice when you're playing against control decks. You already have Force Throw, you potentially have Jedi in hiding, so it's quite a few discard effects. So having Pillage on top of that, maybe in your sideboard, makes it so against some of those slower decks, you get to just kill off their entire hand, letting them not play a turn. And that could be just enough breathing room for you to finish them off. Next up, we have Disabling Fangfighter. If anyone tries to get funny and put a General's Blade on something or a Jedi Lightsaber, well, you get to just knock it off. On top of that, it's pretty good if somebody tries to entrench one of your units. Just an overall fantastic card. If you're playing a red deck, you usually want this in your main or your side. Bombing Run is a card that hasn't seen too much play, but I think at the moment it should be in every red deck side just because of the power of Vader. Bombing Run can sometimes just single-handedly win that matchup because most of their units are 3 health or less. Kit Fisto's Aether Sprite is an interesting alternative to Disabling Fangfighter. It does cost 2 more, but it kills any number of upgrades on a unit. So if you're noticing that there's a lot of, for example, Kylo Rens in your locals or some Gar Saxons, this card can just come in and get rid of all of their upgrades at once and just ruin their day. And of course, finally, Cham Syndulla. He has been an MVP in any red sideboard. It is a great counter to ramp. Of course, if they play a resupply and then you answer with a Cham Syndulla on the next turn, you basically kept up with their ramp, but they got no units in play and you got a 5-4. And on top of that, it works great for decks that even have temporary ramp like Han Solo. If they put a card from their hand into their resources, at the end of the turn, they're going to defeat theirs, but if you Cham, you're not going to defeat yours. So now you get to be ahead of the curve against them. And finally, we're going to take a look at some alternative cards. Now, some of these cards did make it into the second list that I spoke about, but since I think most of my testing has led me more towards the first list, we're going to mention them here as alternative cards. Of course, the first one being Home 1. Home 1 is a fantastic card. It works pretty similarly to Kelleran Beck, except instead of searching from your deck, it gets it from your discard, letting you reuse cards. I've seen some very funny plays with this in a later game when you're up to like 12 or 13 resources. Somebody can play a Home 1, get a Kelleran Beck from their discard, play it, that Kelleran Beck then searches something else. You just flood the board with a ridiculous amount of value. It's a pretty good card. It is obviously not a Jedi or a Force unit, and it is pretty expensive at 8. So if you are trying to build a slightly slower version of Kit Fisto, one that can potentially match against those mid-rangey Yoda and Anakin decks, it is a pretty good option. Next up, we have Hu Yang. It didn't make the cut in my first list, but it is a fantastic card. It is essentially a lightsaber on a body, being a 2/4 himself. And what's very interesting is that Hu Yang is a Jedi. So he will trigger your leader ability, and he is a fantastic card to play on your leader. If you manage to flip and then play Hu Yang on your leader, your Kit Fisto is now a 4/8. That's pretty good for a single card investment. Of course, we have Yoda, a fantastic alternative to Syndralig. Of course, it slows down your deck significantly, not having that extra finisher that deals 8 damage from hand, but Yoda himself is a fantastic card, using the Force to heal from your base and deal a ton of damage. The damage is equal to how many units you have in play, which you usually have a lot of. The main issue with Yoda in this deck is that Yoda works best in decks that can use the Force non-stop, so you usually want to do that in a deck that can use their leader ability to use the Force, and in this case your leader does not use the Force, so it makes Yoda a bit less good than in other decks. Jedi Starfighter, a card that has come in and out of my deck so many times. This is very matchup dependent, so you do have the option of maybe putting this on the side, but I think there is quite the argument to be made to have this in the main. 2 cost, 1/4 is not the amazing stat line that you'd want, but it is a Jedi. It will trigger your leader, and it pretty much nullifies space, especially those aggro space decks like Vader. If you play this on turn 1, on turn 2, there's a good chance you kill off 2 of their plays all at once, denying them the space, denying them their leader ability. Just a fantastic card overall. Mace Windu, another Force Jedi, perfect colors, 7 costs, comes in, ambushes, kills something, readies up, which means you can then hit the base ideally, or maybe even kill a second thing if that's what you want to do. Great card. I just think that Kelleran Beck is enough for 7 costs, I found, but he's a pretty good alternative. And finally, Jedi Consular, one of those cards that everybody thought was going to be crazy. It is a pretty good card, but due to the fact that you don't have an easy way to generate the Force on turn 2 other than by attacking, means that if you play Jedi Consular on turn 1, you usually won't get to use him until turn 3, because on turn 2 you'll need to attack with him to generate the Force, and then on turn 3 you can finally tap him. So for him to have survived up until turn 3 means your opponent doesn't understand your cards, or they got a really unlucky draw. So I think just due to that, he didn't really make the cut for me, but he is still a fantastic card that in some games will just win the game alone, being able to push out a Kelleran Beck 2 turns sooner, makes it so your opponent just doesn't have access to the amount of removal that they need to deal with it. So all that said, guys, I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Kit Fisto? Do you think this is just copium? Do you think he's actually a leader that can see some play? I honestly think that Kit Fisto is severely underestimated by most players. I don't think that he's going to be a meta-defining deck, but I think that it is a leader that you can easily play and win against a lot of the current decks, and he does have a place in the meta, even though it might not be at the top. I would love to hear your thoughts. And once again, guys, if you like what you see, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, subscribe. And on that note, thank you once again for listening, and see you guys next time.